Welcome to the Mindful Return podcast. I'm Kelly Tuttle, a retired neurology nurse practitioner and brain injury survivor. Together, we'll explore practical tools and real stories to help you rebuild focus, confidence, and a meaningful life after a brain injury. Hello and welcome to the Mindful Return. Thank you for joining me. Today in this episode, I'm going to talk about the road to reading again. Before my car accident, I used to be a voracious reader. I read hours upon hours and I loved it. And it was my favorite mode of learning was to read about something new and then try to see how it's done and then do what I've learned on my own. But unfortunately, after my brain injury, I went from reading for hours down to just 5 to 10 minutes before I would just forget what I was reading. It was terrible because I was so desperate to learn how to get better after my brain injury. And my speech therapist gave me these 2 great books to try to help me understand my brain injury and how to recover. But I was frustrated that I could only read maybe a page at a time, and the clock was ticking for me to return to work. So the pressure was pretty high at the time too. But the short of the long story is that I'm today, 10 years later, I am back to reading a ton. I can read for almost as long as I would want to, not completely. I do still get tired, but I'm able to read more complicated books. I'm able to read multiple books and remember where I left off and what I've read. And so that's been really great. And I just wanted to share my reading journey with you. So if you're at the beginning of your recovery, that you know that there is hope and things over time will get better. They may get better really quickly for you, like in a couple of months or a year, or you might have a struggle like myself where it took me 10 years to get to where I am today. So let me talk about my journey and some of the things that helped me get back into learning and what I've learned from other brain injury survivors and from specialists like speech therapists. So reading is really important, and especially if you have to read a lot for your work, your job, professionally, or you have to read either research articles or text manuals to stay on top of what's expected of you at work. But then those of you who loved to read leisurely, it's a really big bummer when you learn that hobby. So hopefully we'll get that slowly back for you. So before your brain injury, reading comprehension and retention was an automatic process with all your brain processes working together. Yet after a brain injury, these key interconnected cognitive processes can be knocked offline and can make reading difficult. Let's talk about some of the barriers to reading after a brain injury. So after a brain injury, you might have double vision or blurred vision, or your eyes aren't working well together. You might find when you're trying to read that you skip lines, you skip words, or while you're reading, you get headaches, develop brain fog, or confusion. So if you're having those issues, make sure that you have your vision checked out to help you see so that you can see better while you're reading. And I'll talk about those specialists later on in this episode. The other thing is that you have low cognitive energy. So your brain is using a ton of energy just to heal. And there's also been a loss of what are called mitochondria organelles that are inside the brain, neurons, the brain cells, and they make energy. And when you've lost powerhouses, then you lose energy and energy reserves. And it takes energy to process the brain cognitive functions that help you with reading. So reading takes energy to focus, comprehend what you're reading, and store the material into your memory. It also takes energy to focus your eyes so that they can move appropriately and send clear visual information to your visual processing centers in your brain and process those letters that you're seeing into words and the words into sentences and the sentences into paragraphs and so forth. So a lot involved with that. It also uses energy to shift from new information or thoughts from sentence to sentence, paragraph to paragraph, and then page to page. And it takes energy for the memory centers to work also, because if you can't remember what you just read or what you read in the paragraph before, it's going to be more difficult for you to comprehend what you're trying to learn and read. Another brain challenge is that these processes, these cognitive processes of putting together what you're trying to read are slowed down. And that pace and the pace that you're trying to take information in can get glitchy, and the information won't get stored in the right places so that you can retrieve them later. That while your brain's healing and these processes are slowed down, that you do more slower intake of information. So that means slowing your visual reading down to match the rate of your brain's processes. So those are more aligned and can function better. Also, a healing brain has difficulty with concentration and focus. It's easily distracted. So when you're reading, you really initially want to make sure you're attempting to do so in a quiet space without any distractions. So if you are used to reading with music on, you need to try and turn the music off until you build up your cognitive stamina. Turn off notifications on your phone and so forth to help support your brain's focus and concentration. The less energy it has to spend on ignoring distractions, the more energy it'll have to you reading the book that you're trying to read. So a poor memory, or a memory that's glitchy after a brain injury, this issue makes it harder for you to remember where you left off in a book and what you just read. Or when you go put the book down, come back and start to read where you left off, you can't remember where you left off or what you read prior to picking the book up. So all these things are like a really huge bummer, but to rebuild the brain strength for reading, it just takes practice and persistence. And some of the strategies that I'm going to share with you can be helpful with getting back to reading after a brain injury. So one of them is to listen to books. And for me, that was a big game changer, because for some reason it was more energy for me to have to read a book, and it probably might be related to my visual issues that hadn't been diagnosed, but I found listening to books really helpful, and I could listen to them a lot longer than I could spend more time listening to books, more so than if I tried to sit down and read. So I really leaned into audiobooks for the first 2 to 3 years after my brain injury. Those were the best for me to allow me to keep healing to allow me to keep reading while my brain was healing. I have heard from other people that they weren't able to initially, after their brain injury, follow audiobooks, and that might be the case for you. Don't give up hope. Hopefully over time, you'll either be able to read from books directly or find that audiobooks you're able to follow along and comprehend and remember the things that you're listening to. And there's a lot of misinformation that listening to audiobooks versus reading books, that you're cheating or something to that effect. It's too easy to listen to a book rather than read a book. And Nadine Gabb, professor of education at Harvard Graduate School, says that the brain works the same way while reading or listening to a book. So both reading or listening to a book are beneficial for the brain. And like I said, early into my recovery, I was leaning really hard on audiobooks. So when I wrote my book, I wanted to make sure that, well, number one, it was easy to read and short and to the point with the strategies you needed to help get better after your brain injury and return to work. But it was also important for me that my book was on Audible, because I knew that there were other brain injury survivors out there like me who were struggling to read but could listen to audiobooks. I wanted to reach those brain injury survivors and make sure that the things that I was sharing were accessible. And so that's why it was really important that I had my book on Audible. And I also read my own Audible. So if you do get my Audible book, you'll get to hear my voice reading the book. But I just remember there's a lot of brain injury survivor books that I wanted to read, but they weren't on Audible. And so therefore they weren't accessible to me to help me heal. So I just wanted to make sure that my book was accessible to all those who were interested in reading or listening to it. Another strategy I found that was really helpful early in my recovery, and I needed to read research articles, was to utilize text-to-speech technology. And I didn't get an app. I know there's apps where you can scan a book and it'll read the book to you. But what I was using was the accessibility tools inside my computer that provided the option of being able to select the text, and then the computer would read the text to you. And I love that because I was having a hard time reading off computers because of the bright light coming from the computer. It was just really harsh on my eyes and just really wore me out. But when I used the text to speech, I could listen to the article and look away, either rest my eyes, or while it was reading the article for me, I could take notes. So that's another strategy that you can consider if you're having to read off the computer. Or what I've said in previous podcast episodes, you can also print the information up and then read it away from bright lights and distractions and so forth. But yeah, I really like that speech to text. And then there's some websites that post news articles or information, and you can listen to the article, which is really nice too. It makes it more accessible. And I did talk to a stroke survivor, and he and I were talking about getting back to reading after our brain injuries. And he told me that he had to listen to a book. So he would get the audio book, and then he would get the hard text book. The way he got his brain processes online so that he could read and learn was by listening to the audiobook while he read the textbook. And this really worked for him and helped him get back onto the road of his journey to reading again. And I shared with him that I really enjoyed listening to audiobooks, and I listen to all kinds of books, but some of them are reference type books. And so I get the text. So I listen to the book and then I get the text. And then when I need to look back on what I had read, or I want to reference it for a paper or a project, such as this podcast, I could pull the text and find the information and just kind of remind me of the information in more detail. So that really helped me with my learning and my reading, having both of those. But I never thought about doing them both at the same time. I think that's pretty clever way of figuring out how to support your brain. So another strategy when you're reading is that you need to slow down the rate of how your eyes are processing the information so that it matches your brain's ability to process the information. And one way to slow down the information is to, when you're listening to books, to consider pausing the book and just taking up a moment to think about what you just heard or listened to, and try to mindfully store it next to, maybe some foundational knowledge you already have. And I kind of call this intentional learning or intentionally filing information. Is just kind of slowing things down and just really thinking about what you just read. And then how can I relate this to something I already know so that I can remember better later? So ways to slow down your reading and improve your comprehension of what you're reading is to read out loud. So it's kind of repetitive technique where you're visually seeing what you're reading and then you're hearing what you're reading. And just reading out loud, it's a slower pace of reading compared to if you just read in your head, because you're having to use your communication processing centers too in your brain. So that's one way to slow down your reading to better match the pace of your brain's ability to process the information. One of the things I found really helpful was to use a piece of paper to help guide my vision as I read. And that's another way to help support your brain as it's healing by using an external tool to help it do what it needs to do without having to expend unnecessary energy. So using a piece of paper under the line helps guide your gaze as you're trying to read, and then you're spending less energy trying to maintain your place on the page. But it also slows down what your reading process too. And then another technique that's similar is just using your finger while you're reading. So really just putting your finger on the sentence and dragging it as you read it. And that helps with the visual gaze along the line and slow down the reading process. And then the other thing that helps you slow down your reading process is stopping and taking notes about what you've read. And that process of converting what you've read into handwriting is a really great learning tool to help solidify that information into the cortex of your brain. It also slows down your reading. It makes you stop and reflect. It makes you think about what you're reading and put it in your own words, which is a great learning tool also. So stopping and taking notes will help with your reading process too. And then when you read, you really want to read in a quiet spot away from distractions. You want to turn off your phone notifications or flip your phone over so you can't see them. If you in the past were able to read with music in the background or the TV, you should turn those off so that you can spend your energy on your brain processes for the reading rather than filtering out these distractions. And then, later on, you can try different types of music. So maybe something more quieter or gentler than you had read to in the past. And just work yourself up as your cognitive stamina increases. Another strategy I learned from a brain injury survivor was to use sticky notes. And I thought this was a really good idea. So you read whatever it is, and you realize it's time to take a break. What you do is you write a summary of what you've just read, and you place the sticky note where you left off. And then before you start resuming to read the book, you review the sticky note to remind you what you've already read. So I thought that was a really neat strategy. And then one of my favorites I found worked for me was, and people who are book lovers may cringe when they hear me say this, but I had to resort to this to help with my memory. And that was highlighting the things that I read, underlining, and I even would write notes in the margins. I didn't think about sticky notes at the time. That might have saved some of my books, but that's okay. That's what worked for me, and that might work for you. And so I liked highlighting and underlining important things that I wanted to read, because then it was easy for me to flip back and reference the information, and then not waste time or energy having to read the whole page or the paragraph in order to find the information. So if you start to develop brain injury symptoms such as brain fog, confusion, headaches, that is the time you need to stop and take a break. If you're seeing that you're having difficulty with your concentration, your mind starts wandering off, or you're not remembering what you read, that's when it's time to take a break. The best breaks I have found for me is when I take a break and I get up and I move around. So I might get up and clean the kitchen, or, do some Tai Chi, and then sitting down and trying to read again. And the other thing too is I want you to know it's okay to quit books that are too complicated to follow. If you're having a hard time, like some of these novels have these huge world building and multiple characters kind of thing. And they're fantastic. When you're struggling with your memory and retaining information and so forth, those can be really hard to follow. So just set those aside for your someday a reading list, and that's okay. And don't get frustrated. Those are hard books to read even without a brain injury at times. Be okay with quitting, not reading something that isn't making sense to you, is not bringing joy to you. That's the point. The point of reading is to enjoy the reading, and understand it and get a sense of accomplishment that you finished whatever it was that you're reading. Even at times like when I read scientific papers, I will find myself reading a sentence 3 or 4 times. And if I don't understand it, I just move on. And so just letting it go and moving on, it's okay. Just do it. And then you want to set manageable goals. So you really need to get to know what your reading tolerance is. And how you do that is when you sit down to read, is you set a timer and you read. And the minute, you start getting headaches, you have confusion, brain fog, your mind wanders, you stop and you look at that time and say it's 15 minutes, then you know that your reading time is actually 10 minutes. So when you start to read and you're trying to strengthen your brain, you'll want to just sit and do those increments of reading. So just 10 minutes at a time. And then as time goes by, whether it's a couple weeks or a month or two, then you try to expand on your reading time and see how you do. So that's another good way to build up your brain strength for reading again. Another strategy is don't read when you're tired or you're fatigued or you have a headache. Unless you were like me, and I had headaches every day for 4 years after my brain injury. And so I would just read on the days that I had less of a headache. But you need to find your kind of like your balance. But after a brain injury, you really can't do that, because at the end of the day, you're just too tired to read or to use your cognitive functioning, complex cognitive functioning processes. So the evening time or the end of the day, that's like the worst time to try to do anything as a brain injury survivor, let alone try to read. So when you're trying to build up your reading skills and enjoy your reading again or learn something new, try to do it when you're at your peak energy time. And that could be the first thing in the morning, or it could be 2 hours after you wake up, or maybe you're a night owl and it's when the sun sets. Whenever that time is, you want to read during that time and not when you're tired and fatigued and grumpy. Another thing I found which helped me get back into reading was reading books with large print. And I think a lot of us associate large print books with people who are older, but I found them really helpful because I felt like I spent less energy trying to focus my vision on tiny type or font and then able to read longer. So you might want to consider, if you're having fatigue with reading, to try to find books in large print. Now, for those of you who have to read for work or your profession and you're reading articles, start out with first trying to read simple, short articles. Again, trying to build up your brain strength in reading. So start with really small baby steps. So really easy, quick to the point, easy to follow research article. And then when you do try to read a more complicated research article, at first, why don't you just start with reading the abstract and then skipping down to the conclusion to get the gist of the article. And then if you still have energy, or over time when you're building up your cognitive strength, then you can start looking at the illustrations and then the graphs. So it's just kind of you're building up on your old skills. So you're going to just start off with reading the abstract and then reading the conclusion. And then the next time, as time passes and you start reading articles, you're going to read the abstract, the conclusion, the illustrations, and then the graphs. And then as time passes and your cognitive strength is going up and your brain processes are improving, then you can start looking again at the data interpretation. But don't do that until you've built up your brain reading strength. So just taking baby steps. That's what this is all about. And so when you're taking the baby steps towards building your reading strength, you want to start with early into recovery. If you're really struggling with reading, I've heard other brain injury survivors start with simple picture books. Start reading, if you have kids, reading their books to them. And that's a great way for you to spend time with your kids and work on your reading skills. So that is a great way in taking a baby step towards getting back to your old reading habits. And then reading the books out loud will help the brain get it back into shape for reading too. And for me, what I discovered was when I was having a hard time reading was I could enjoy comic books. I found that in comic books, you have the art, you can enjoy the art, and that kind of gets that mindful thinking and kind of the critical thinking of thinking about the picture and looking at the characters' faces and kind of tapping into your imagination with the pictures. And then in comic books, they're always written in those thought bubbles or speaking bubbles. So they're short, brief blocks of sentences that you can read and get a sense of accomplishment when you finish it, and you can turn to the next page. And I started out with reading just the episodes. So if you're not a comic book person, they come out like every week, a new episode. So they're really short and they're thin books and they're really great. And when I first started reading, I could only read half of it, and then I would have to rest and then come back, and then I could read the other half. And these are really short books, but this is what I had to do because I love reading and I love comics and I love superheroes. So this is right down my alley. If you can slowly build up with the comic books and start reading graphic novels, which are the episodes put all together. And so it's kind of like a chapter. And you get a really good sense of accomplishment as you work through the graphic novel. But anyway, that's an option of a way to rebuild your reading strength is reading comic books. The other thing, I heard another brain injury survivor say that reading poetry was really helpful in getting back to reading. And poetry's great. And so I started reading poetry. Now, not the complicated stuff like in the classics, but more of the modern poetry. It's super short, easy to read, and so forth. And that was really great because if you read the poem, then you're getting that sense of accomplishment that you've read something and finished it. The other thing is that poetry challenges abstract and creative thoughts and aids in critical thinking and problem solving. So that's why poetry is really good for the brain, because you're having to kind of get the meaning of certain words. Also, poetry helps you with processing complex emotions, and it's been also shown to reduce pain intensity. One of the books that I'm currently reading that's a book of poetry is Donna Ashworth, and it's titled Wild Hope, Healing Words and Finding Light on Dark Days. And I have really been enjoying reading her poems because they offer insights into having hope when you're going through rough things. So you might consider starting her out with her book. It's really great. And it's just, the poems are short, they're to the point, they make you think, and then they give you that sense of accomplishment when you finish it. So I was reading a Substack on New Year's resolutions, and this writer was saying instead of New Year's resolutions, you should have new rituals. And one of the rituals that was recommended in this article was reading one poem a day. And so I have been doing that, and it's been fantastic because sometimes I forget I have poetry books and that I want to read them. And setting one out and making a commitment to reading a poem a day has helped me start to read my poetry collections. You might want to consider that also in your strategies to help build your reading strength of your brain. And then as time passes, hopefully you'll be able to graduate to chapter books. And I've heard from others, and I also found for myself that starting out with like middle school type chapter books was a great way of taking that next baby step, because the print is large and they only have 2 or 3 characters in it, not a whole lot of characters, not a huge world building complex narrative that you've got to try to figure out and memorize. So there's some really great middle school books out there that are award-winning books that you should check out. I tried to remember which ones I had read. I think I read like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and I read The Wizard of Oz, and I read a bunch of other books. Unfortunately, I can't remember the names of them. And they were really great, easy to follow. And then when I finished them, I had this great sense of accomplishment. And then in the process, I'm building up my brain reading strength. So if you're up to reading chapter books, but picking up a regular really thick volume book is just too much for you, then consider these middle school books. You can get them at your library and start reading those. Maybe some classics that you enjoyed when you were a kid, or some classics that you'd heard about but hadn't had time to read. Yeah, check those books out. They're great. You and your brain will enjoy them. And then over time, gradually, what you're going to see is you're going to see an increased ability for more complex reading. If you're struggling to read, don't get frustrated and quit. Reach out to a specialist to help you out. So that could be your doctor. Talk to your doctor about it, why you're struggling, the symptoms you're having when you're trying to read, what's going on, so they can figure out the right referral to send you to the right person. And one of those people is a speech therapist. They're great at helping you with your cognitive functioning and your reading skills, your reading and comprehension skills. Check out tapping into their resources to help you for your specific reading needs. And the other thing I can't impress enough is to make sure your vision is okay, because it's huge and a complicated process, and it is important in your ability to read. So make sure you're seeing a vision specialist. And 2 of them that I can think of is the behavioral optometrist that I told you about, that diagnosed me with the binocular vision dysfunction. Because my vision was off, I was having to tilt my head to the right to align my reading. And they gave me a prescription that helped align my eyes and their functioning. And I was able to read so much more, not like overnight. I don't want to mislead you, but over time, it made a big difference. So if you're having a hard time reading, maybe consider consulting with a behavioral optometrist, and you don't need a referral to see them. You can go on website and go to like the behavioral optometrists. I think it's association or foundation or something like that, probably association, their website, and find one that is in your local area. And then the other person to consider is a neurotherapist, because reading, you have to track the words. And if you're having difficulty with tracking objects with your eyes, a neurotherapist can help you with that. So reading is a really complicated process, and early into your recovery, and as you're recovering, you might find reading very frustrating, but it's definitely a worthwhile endeavor because it helps build new connections. It supports neuroplasticity. It's going to help you with your critical thinking and managing of your emotions. So don't give up. And hopefully your journey is not as long as mine. It took me 10 years to get to this point. So even if you're 5 years out, don't give up. And keep trying to get back to reading and enjoying reading and learning new things. So take care, get better, get stronger. You've been listening to the Mindful Return podcast with me, Kelly Tuttle. Subscribe wherever you listen and head to kellytuttle.org for brain injury recovery tools, free resources, and inspiration to help you return to work with confidence and hope.